The low hum of the courtroom pressed down on me like a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. I sat rigid, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, my mind consumed by the image of her face, Tanya, my wife. Or rather, the woman I had thought I knew. From the beginning, the divorce proceedings had been nothing short of brutal. Her lawyers were vultures, circling, waiting for the opportunity to pick apart the life we had built together, eager to bleed me dry. I had known this battle would be ugly, had expected them to paint me as the villain, the one responsible for the collapse of our marriage. For 4 long months, I had been running on fumes, barely sleeping, barely eating, simply surviving. When they told me she had moved on, I had assumed they meant she had gone to stay with her mother or found a new place of her own. It had never crossed my mind that moving on meant something far more devastating. But today was different. Today, she would have to look me in the eye and answer for what she had done. Adultery. The word itself had been a blade when I had first whispered it to my lawyer, not because of its meaning, but because now it was undeniable. It was truth. I had not wanted to believe it, had clung desperately to the possibility that it was all a misunderstanding. But I had seen enough. I knew better now. She sat across from me, poised and composed, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost serene. "I have nothing to hide, Your Honor," she said, her gaze unwavering, never once flickering in my direction. I wanted to scream, to shatter the composed mask she wore so effortlessly. How could she sit there so brazen, so unapologetic? The sheer audacity of it all was suffocating. Beside me, my lawyer, Mr. Thompson, gave me a reassuring nod. His presence was a steady anchor in the storm. He had been thorough, meticulous, and unwavering in his confidence. He had assured me that our evidence was irrefutable. And then the courtroom door opened. A man I had never seen before stepped inside, his presence quiet yet commanding. He was tall, with tired eyes and a solemn expression. In his hands, he carried a simple manila envelope. Mr. Ramirez, the private investigator I had hired. Tanya saw him, and for the first time, her composure cracked. The color drained from her face, her hands, so still moments ago, began to tremble. A small, involuntary gasp slipped from her lips. It was like watching a mask slip from an actor's face. The illusion shattered. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt something shift inside me. The tight, suffocating knot of helplessness in my chest loosened ever so slightly. Mr. Ramirez was sworn in, his voice even and unwavering as he began to recount his findings. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Surveillance, coded messages, secret rendezvous in hidden corners of the city. Methodically, he laid out the details, his words sharp and precise. He spoke of late-night meetings in hotel rooms, of weekends spent in secrecy. The truth was no longer abstract. It was cold. It was brutal. It was undeniable. And the man, Jerome, a name I knew, a man I had met, a friend of a friend. The betrayal was not just intimate. It was insidious. She had been living this lie right under my nose. I watched as Tanya shifted in her seat, a deep flush creeping up her neck, staining her cheeks. Her fingers fidgeted in her lap, her once steady hands betraying her. Then, finally, she looked at me. Her eyes were wide, panicked, ashamed. Piece by piece, her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Mr. Thompson pressed on, his voice steady, relentless. "Mrs. Carter, can you explain the multiple trips to the Ocean View Hotel, registered under the name Mr. and Mrs. Davis's? Silence. Can you explain the text messages on your phone discussing meeting Jerome there? More silence. These messages were deleted, Mrs. Carter. But Mr. Ramirez was able to retrieve them." Tanya's stare dropped to the floor. She had no defense left. The judge, a woman with a stern face and tired eyes, turned to her, her voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Carter, do you have anything to say to these allegations?" Tanya finally spoke, but her voice was barely more than a whisper. I don't know what to say." And just like that, the last remnants of her bravado crumbled. I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, I saw her for who she truly was. Not the woman I had married. Not the woman I had loved. A stranger. A liar. A cheat. The judge ruled in my favor. The divorce would proceed, with a fair division of assets. The consequences of her deception were now laid bare for all to see. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was validation. An acknowledgement of the pain I had endured. Justice. As I walked out of the courtroom, I saw her standing by the entrance, head bowed. The arrogance, the false confidence, it was all gone. She looked small, defeated, Alone. And in a way, that was satisfaction enough. I walked past her without a word, without a glance. The bitterness still lingered, a cold weight in my chest, but it no longer consumed me. She would live with the shame, with the consequences. And for the first time in months, I took a deep breath. A slow, steady exhale, releasing the pain, the anger, the betrayal. I had been broken, but now I was beginning to piece myself back together. This was the first step, and I took it, out the doors, away from her, towards something new. She was nothing more than a ghost now, a specter of who I once thought she was. I felt no joy, no triumph, only a profound sadness. Sadness for the love we never truly shared, for the life we could have had, for the lies she chose over us. But as I stepped into the golden afternoon light, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally free, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to begin again.